I just wanted to sort of situate Black Lives Matter in the current political context. Uh, and I want to structure this talk. I want to first sort of set out the framework first before discussing BLM directly. So that may take a while. So I beg people's forbearance. The BLM protests that especially exploded, they began in 2012, but they took off like lightning after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th, 2020. But the current period has been marked by chaotic upsurges that are both politically ambiguous and kind of formless. Mid 2020, for example, saw mass protests in the Sudan in favor of speeded up government reform, in Belarus against strongman Alexander Lukashenko, in Kyrgyzstan against President Suranbay Jeenbekov, who was subsequently forced out of office, and in Peru against interim President Manuel Merino in November 2020, who was also forced to step down due to popular pressure. And as the diverse nature of the protests, of such protests show, the overall tone is one of populism, centrism, political ambiguity, and neither left nor right, but somewhere in the amorphous center. And this is what you would expect in a period of growing populism amid deepening labor retreat. I mean, the more the left weakens, the more a sort of vast amorphous zone opens up in the center for the expression of populist frustration. And so that seems to be what is behind so much of the popular unrest that's taking place these days. And I also wanted to get onto the question of class, obviously, central concern of the Communist University. And Marxists typically associate these kinds of formless, ambiguous protests with the middle class. So a few words about the nature of the middle class and middle class politics is necessary, I believe, at this point. And this will be familiar, of course, to I'm sure to all my listeners. But the middle class is an intermediate class torn between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It's chronically unstable since it tends to melt into one or the other depending on the circumstances. And due to the dual nature or the two-sided nature of middle class politics, they are at their most reactionary when seemingly at their most progressive. So middle class politics, while they may augur, they may be promising from a Marxist point of view, they're also very dangerous from a Marxist point of view. And attempts by revisionists such as most notably Ernest Mandel to elide the difference between middle and working class politics inevitably backfire to the detriment of the socialist movement. So it's not a matter of purity, of keeping our skirts clean, of maintaining a holier than thou attitude towards middle class politics, but of maintaining the integrity of the working class movement and Marxist political analysis. And the degree to the degree the middle class has a program that it can call its own, it consists of an attempt to generalize its own atomized nature and impose it on larger society. So this implies egoism, individualism, anti-bigness, anti-centralization, anti-science and industry, anti-rationalism, and anti-democratic snobbery. It also implies rule by a self-appointed middle-class elite by virtue of its own self-evident moral supremacy, a kind of parliament of saints. But this moral supremacy is self-evident. When I say it's self-evident to the middle class. So it's a rule of by and for a middle-class moral elite. And I would also point out that that even when the middle class tries to be anti-racist, it ends up replicating the racism of the class to which it is essentially subservient, i.e. that of the bourgeoisie. So now I want to go on to the broader US context, if I may. The great contradiction in modern American life is that between a global empire and at the core, what remains a fundamentally 18th century state. When the framers gathered in Philadelphia in 1787, there was still a French monarchy, a Holy Roman Empire, and papal states ruling over much of central Italy. The US subsequently took on many democratic aspects from the 1820s and 30s on, but it tended to layer them on top of what remained a pre-democratic constitutional structure. So in many ways, it looks democratic, it sounds democratic, it tastes democratic, but at a fundamental level, it is anything but. So the result is what is in certain respects an ultra-modern society, but at the same time, the last of the ancien regimes, since it actually predated the French Revolution, and in many ways was quite hostile to it. One result is that the basic democratic precept of political equality, otherwise known as one person, one vote, is violated at every turn in the US political structure. In the Senate, in the Electoral College, in the House of Representatives due to rampant gerrymandering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The examples go on. In fact, one can say that the US system is built on rather than equal vote, equal rights, or political equality, it's based on weighted voting, indirect representation, et cetera, all of which is really much more 18th century than it is 21st century. And racial equality is similarly violated at every turn under what remains fundamentally a slaveholder's constitution. The Electoral College is as biased in favor of rural white states such as Wyoming, the Dakotas, Vermont, et cetera. And gerrymandering in the House. I presume everyone here knows what gerrymandering is really, it's implicitly racist. It's not explicitly racist because no one's allowed to be explicitly racist anymore, but otherwise it is thoroughly racist. And the Senate, which is the dominant of the two houses, of the two legislative chambers, is especially outrageous due to the principle of equal state representation. This means that California, a majority state, i.e. one in which minorities like Blacks, Hispanic, Asians constitute a majority of the population, has the same number of votes as a lily white state of Wyoming, even though California's population is nearly 70 times greater. Equal state representation means that the 53% of the US population that lives in just 10 states are outvoted 4-1 by the minority in the other 40. It also means that the 81.5% of minorities, again, Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, etc., that live in the same top 10 are massively outvoted as well. So the term structural racism is tossed around willy-nilly, but this is structural racism at its clearest. I mean, it's a system which essentially undercounts Black votes and overcounts white votes. There could be nothing more thoroughly racist than that. But because the Constitution is as central to American life as the Bible was to medieval Europe, or the Quran is to contemporary Saudi Arabia or Iran, it is essentially beyond discussion. There is no way of bringing it up. To be fair, that may be changing a bit in the last few years, but still that is overwhelmingly the case. And thanks to the pre-democratic Constitution, America has not had a mass socialist movement since 1920, when Eugene V. Debs got 1 million votes for president while serving while serving time in a federal prison for opposing U.S. entry into World War I. The combination of mass repression that was truly on the scale of Mussolini's Italy, plus the 1920s capitalist boom, made it almost impossible to discuss socialism as well. Indeed, it sort of rendered the very idea of socialism as virtually unintelligible. So the absence of a mass labor party implied the universalization of petty bourgeois and or bourgeois consciousness, not just for months or years, but for decades on end, with no end as yet in sight. Class analysis is thus unconstitutional in a very real sense. And Americans are unable to see society other than in ultra-pluralist terms as a multitude of contending special interests. If you're liberal, therefore, you tend to be pro-Black, pro-female, pro-gay, etc. And if you're conservative, you are the opposite. But there's no sense on the left of how such atomized pluralism undermines anything resembling socialist analysis. And finally, now on to BLM, which is a middle estimate which ends up replicating, not combating, but replicating the racism of the class above. BLM thus encapsulates all that's backward about bourgeois American society. The movement began as a hashtag or slogan in response to the Trayvon Martin murder at the hands of George Zimmerman in 2012. I don't know if people recall, but Trayvon Martin was a young Black male who aroused the suspicion of a self-appointed neighborhood guardian because he was wearing a hooded sweatshirt. The guardian, Zimmerman, stopped him and ended up shooting and killing him. There's no doubt that this is a clear cut. There's little ambiguity about this murder, and that Martin was a victim of racism. So at the time, it seemed self-evident that it was important to assert that Black lives do matter, and that such crimes should not be tolerated. Besides, who could disagree? I mean, after all, don't all lives matter? The problem with that response is that it was a thought crime as defined by the new emerging BLM dogma. Alicia Garza, one of BLM's 3 co-founders, made a point of denouncing any and all assertions that, quote, all lives matter, brown lives matter, migrant lives matter, women's lives matter, and on, close quote. This is how she put it in an essay in 2014. She went on to explain, we perpetuate a level of white supremacist domination by reproducing a tired trope that we are all the same, rather than acknowledging that non-Black oppressed people in this country are both impacted by racism and domination, and simultaneously benefit from anti-Black racism. We are asking you, our family, to stand with us in affirming Black lives, not just all lives, Black lives. Please do not change the conversation by talking about how your life matters too. Let me put the website for this this essay on the screen, just another place. So here is the website. So the flip side of the BLM slogan, Black Lives Matter, was an injunction to regard Black oppression as singular, unique, and moral and metaphysical, as opposed to political and class-based. It was similarly an injunction against drawing links between Black oppression and the oppression of Hispanics, migrants, gays, etc., much less that of workers in general, all of whom were deemed to benefit from anti-Black racism. A Central American migrant on the run from ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Police, a poor white woman seeking an abortion in a state where the procedure has been essentially outlawed, a white worker in areas ravaged by deindustrialization, crime, and opiate addiction. Such people are thus beneficiaries, according to BLM, of bourgeois racism. In fact, and on a strictly logical basis, Black Lives Matter and all lives matter are complementary in the same sense that all for one and one for all are complementary. Rather than undermining or diminishing, they strengthen one another by closing the loop. If all lives matter, then Black lives matter, and Black lives must matter for all lives to matter as well. Communists have traditionally emphasized this by asserting that if a white worker subjects a fellow Black worker to a racist attack, it's not up to other Black workers to rise to this person's defense, but it's the responsibility of whites to defend this Black person from racist attack. And what is equally important is vice versa. In other words, if a white person, the white worker, is attacked on racial grounds, it's up to, by a Black on racial grounds, it's up to Black workers to defend that white person against that kind of racist attack. Working class unity means that all whites must combat racism wherever it rears its head, among whites, Blacks, or whatever. But BLM's rejection of ALM, the All Lives Matter slogan, all but assured that ALM would be appropriated by the right wing, and shades of the famous war in Gulliver's Travels, when people argue over whether to crack open an egg on the pointed or the rounded side, the US was soon filled with leftists in writing shouting BLM and ALM at one another. In other words, it was the ultimate absurdity. So now on to the movement itself, finally. BLM demonstrations exploded after the George Floyd murder on May 25th, 2020. occurring not just in Minneapolis, which is where Floyd was killed, but in scores of other US cities, not to mention in Australia, Brazil, Canada, Denmark, Japan, and of course the UK. And on a personal note, I was recovering from knee surgery at the time, but I managed to hobble along in one protest in New York. And what I found was a kind of a carnival atmosphere as thousands of young people took to the streets despite the lockdown. The weather was fantastic. It was the spring. It was really just wonderful to be outside amid so many people. The protests were multiracial, and that marked a dramatic change from the 1960s, especially the urban riots of the 1960s, where blacks alone took the streets and whites fled as quickly as possible. So the protests were multiracial and marked by a heady sense of solidarity. It was really quite lovely to see. But what is equally important, and which must be stressed, is that the protests were almost completely depoliticized. In other words, there were no signs, no people selling radical literature, no debating among the crowd about racism and related issues. None of that sort. I mean, it was a time of good feelings, but seemingly little political debate or even thought. And then things started turning weird, especially due to the all-American proliferation of guns. In Seattle, where BLM protesters set up a quote autonomous zone in a downtown area, about a half dozen blocks in downtown Seattle. Self-appointed guards armed with assault rifles began patrolling the autonomous zone, and 6 people wound up shot between June 20th and June 29th, a 10-day period. One of them, a Black teenager named Antonio Mays, was killed. He was just 16 years old. Portland, Oregon, a few hundred miles to the south, turned into a war zone between Antifa and Proud Boys. The battles raged for months, and in fact, they're still going on more than a year later. In Austin, a protester was killed because he approached a stalled car while carrying an assault rifle, and the person inside the car took fright and shot him dead with a pistol. And in Louisville, Kentucky, heavily armed Black and white militias, consisting of hundreds of people each, armed with assault rifles and bulletproof vests, et cetera, nearly came within a few blocks of one another in September 2020. If they had actually met, there might very well have been civil war in the streets of Louisville, Kentucky. So to sum up, BLM is a near perfect expression of the current US political plight. The BLM slogan led to centrist politics and a truncation of political thought, and amounted to a deliberate attempt to short circuit any and all attempts aimed at situating Black oppression in a larger political context. There was no discussion of the US Constitution, needless to say. There was no discussion of the special problem of US policing, i.e. the fact that the US, due to states' rights and an ultra-federalized structure, has 18,000 separate police departments that are largely autonomous and subject to only sporadic oversight. 18,000 police departments. No discussion of the white victims of Black violence, of police violence, even though Blacks account for only 25% of the total. And when you plug in various forms of class analysis, you find that economic status turns out to be a stronger determinant of who is victimized by police violence than race. And no discussion of the working class. And indeed, a socialist friend of mine found himself harassed when he tried to distribute socialist literature at a BLM demonstration. There was also a close alliance with the Democratic Party, especially since that shallow BLM moralism fits in neatly with Democratic Party ideology. And no discussion of wealth polarization and its racial consequences. For example, I'm struck by the comparison to Yugoslavia in the 1980s, when a deepening economic breakdown led to a breakdown in among the Yugoslav republics. In other words, the economic breakdown had a consequence of driving ever further apart relatively wealthy republics like Slovenia and poor ones like Kosovo. And I think what we're seeing in the US is something really very similar, where economic polarization is driving ethno-racial groups apart as well. A few Black Americans are making out okay amid the despite economic polarization, but for the great mass of American Blacks, the trajectory has been one of ever downward relative to the U.S. economy as a whole. So economic polarization seems to breed racial polarization. But yet there was no discussion in these protests by the movement, et cetera, about how this dynamic works. And also inevitably, there was the inevitable corruption. Polls showed for a time sky-high support for BLM. And as a result, money flowed into something called the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation to the tune of $90 million in 2020 alone. The Ford Foundation and other philanthropies have meanwhile channeled $100 million into a group called the Black-Led Movement Fund, which supposedly supports the movement for Black Lives, which supposedly supports BLM. But the eagerness of the Ford Foundation to step forward and fund BLM and its various offshoots, and the eagerness of BLM to receive that money and to enter an alliance with the Ford Foundation is yet another illustration of the principle of the petty bourgeoisie seeking to adapt and integrate itself into the ranks of the grande bourgeoisie and allowing the grande bourgeoisie to dictate its program. And as all those overlapping names and organizations, the Black-Led Movement Fund, the Movement for Black Lives Matter, et cetera, shows transparency is nil. I mean, no one knows where their contributions were going to. No one knew what specific organizations to contribute to, et cetera. So opportunities, when so much money is sloshing through various sluice gates, the opportunities for abuse are rife. And indeed, Patrice Cullors, another of BLM's three founders, was forced to resign. It was revealed that she had gone on a real estate buying spree, purchasing 4 homes around the country. And it's not clear whether she actually used BLM funds to purchase those homes, but she suddenly found herself with the means to engage in the kind of those kinds of real estate acquisitions. And Patrice Colors has since entered into a TV development deal with Warner Brothers to develop a series of programs highlighting the Black experience. And then we saw all these CEOs, most especially Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, taking the knee in order to express solidarity with BLM. So the movement was very quickly corrupted and corporatized. So what has happened since? What have the results been? And I know that when I gave a previous talk, I forgot when, about BLM, in which I expressed expressed a great deal of skepticism, and I thought that a number of people who were taking part in the discussion thought that I had gone too far. But I think that subsequent events have shown that my skepticism was not unwarranted. For example, one of the few specific demands that BLM gave rise to was the defund the police movement. But the defund the police movement has been a complete and total flop. One poll in May 2020 found that less than 20% of American adults supported cutting police funding. Another poll a month later found that US adults opposed defunding the police by 2 to 1. And a Gallup poll shortly later found that 81% of Black Americans wanted the cops to spend as much time or more in their neighborhoods versus 86% of the sample as a whole. So 81 versus 86%, virtually no difference. And Democrats flocked around the defund the police banner at the time, but since then they have been beating a hasty retreat. Just this last month, there was a congressional hearing into the last January's Capitol Hill uprising, which I wrote about in the Weekly Worker, and the Democrats fell over one another, praising the police for battling off the mob on January 6th. And predictably, a liberal New York columnist followed up 4 days later with a piece entitled, "Why Do Republicans Hate Cops?" In other words, the Democrats, after siding with the defund the police slogan in 2020, in 2021 are now attempting to portray themselves as more pro-police than their Republican opponents. And even more interesting. Oh, and Cory Booker, a Black Democratic senator from New Jersey, recently took to the Senate floor to denounce as, quote, scurrilous, unquote, accusations that Democrats ever backed defunding the police. And finally, Eric Adams, who is likely going to be New York City's next mayor, who was a Black ex-cop, ran on a pro-police platform and did especially well in Black neighborhoods. So the defund the police movement has failed to catch on with either with the American population in general, or more specifically, Black Americans. And BLM, due to its truncated politics, has left nothing behind in terms of an organization, mass organization, things that people can take part in. It's left behind no intellectual legacy, as far as I can see, or in fact, it's left behind actually what is a rather toxic, negative intellectual legacy. I mean, for example, one of the few, besides defund the police movement, one of the few ideas that BLM did give rise to was the concept of white privilege or white fragility, which is the title of a best-selling book by a woman named Robin DiAngelo. And the idea, this is the idea that all whites benefit from anti-Black racism, no matter how otherwise oppressed and impoverished they may be. It's also led to a concept, and this is a very interesting idea, repellent but interesting, idea of whiteness as a political construct. This is a theory developed by a couple of left Stalinists named Noel Ignatieff and Theodore Allen, who left the Communist Party in the late 1950s, and developed a theory about whiteness, which was a bit similar to what Jerry Downing the other day was saying about the Protestants in Northern Ireland, in that they are not in any sense an ethnic community or a national community, but are a political community that defines itself by its right-wing politics and its hostility to democracy. And this theory is that that whiteness is a political construct that is defined by its inherent racism, its inherent anti-Blackness. And so that therefore Ignatieff, and to a lesser degree Allen, but certainly Ignatieff, whom by the way, I've known vaguely over the years, Ignatieff has called for a war on whiteness, where white people must renounce their whiteness as the first step towards somehow overcoming America's long racial tradition of racism, and this has become a major theme in the culture wars. Ignatieff was actually kind of half endorsed by various bourgeois publications, most notably the New Yorker magazine. And to me, the idea that if you go up to some impoverished worker in deindustrialized, hinterlands, and tell them that he is a beneficiary, he or she is a beneficiary of white privilege, I mean, this to me is God's gift to the right wing, because any such message will have the effect of infuriating that white worker, of driving him into the arms of the right, and convincing him that the left consists of self-appointed, self-congratulating liberal elitists whose only interest is in demonstrating their own moral superiority to the mass of white rednecks out there whose economic sufferings are entirely their own fault, because by refusing to renounce their whiteness, they have plainly bought into a structure of deeply ingrained racism. And this strikes me as utterly perverse and backward, and completely contrary to everything the socialist movement stands for. But yet it has become a dominant theme among much of the American left. So summing up, we had a lot of sound and fury that has left America pretty much as it was. The defund the movement has vanished. A pro-police ex-cop is about to become mayor of New York City with extensive Black support. and the right is going wild, having a field day with the movement against what are called critical white studies, which is sort of an attempt to incorporate this idea of white privilege and incorporate it into the school curriculum, et cetera. And they're having a wonderful time of it. And they're having a wonderful time of it because parents are justly concerned by what is taking place in classrooms. And I have a 12-year-old who's in the 8th grade or 7th grade, going to the 8th grade, and believe me, this movement is quite powerful, quite real. She comes home every day and parrots what she's told in school, and it's all about white privilege, and the necessarily separate ways that Black and white people view the world, and the fact that they are by definition mutually incomprehensible, and that different rules must of necessity apply to different to each group. And this has just created an opening that the right is gleefully surging through. So the sum total, the effect is it has the BLM is it produced nothing by way of police reform, and actually handed the right wing a lovely gift-wrapped present in the form of critical race studies, which has allowed it to turn tables on liberals and on BLM generally. So it's a rather grim analysis, but I think that anybody who looks who looks at the current state of politics in America will recognize that it's unfortunately true. Rather than turning things around, BLM was proved ineffectual or may actually have backfired in such a way as to intensify the drift to the right. And that is not what a socialist anti-racist movement tries to do, but a socialist anti-racist movement tries to fight racism by uniting the working class behind racism, behind anti-racism, in a way which I believe is much more productive and politically effective. So that's it. Over to you, Kevin.